This chapter's about what is translated as the psychological tendency. In Buddhism, there's a term, Samskaras, which is translated as psychological tendencies, that are a contributing factor to the notion of an individual, of a self, to the notion of a self, or personality, actually. The samskaras, or the psychological tendencies, are what determine the ways which our attention gets hijacked. The situation is that our attention is being taken here, taken there, from moment to moment, and it gets caught up, it gets lost in whatever it's drawn to, and obviously gets drawn to something because of a particular emotional pull, and this would be our psychological tendency. But there's a bit more to it than that. Vasistha continued, the psychological tendency, or mental disposition, or mental conditioning, is unreal. Yet it does arise in the mind. Hence it can be compared to the vision of two moons in a person suffering from diplopia. So diplopia is obviously some kind of double vision. So it's saying here that this psychological tendency is unreal. Now what underlies this psychological tendency is the belief that there's an external world out there. And it's that which is unreal. The psychological tendencies are based on that assumption that there is something out there. It's rather like this. We're in the situation of the sculptor who makes a sculpture of the sculptor who makes a sculpture of a beautiful woman and falls in love with her. Falls in love with his own creation. He assumes that that creation is somehow something different from him. So this notion that there is something out there, it's false. It's a delusion. Hence, this tendency should be renounced as if it were sheer delusion. The product of ignorance is real only to the ignorant person. To the wise, it is just a verbal expression, just as one speaks of the barren woman's son. So sometimes we talk about objects, sometimes we talk about the world, and so on. These are we need to use these notions in order to communicate. But that's all they are. They're just notions. Do not remain ignorant, O Rama, but strive to be wise. By renouncing mental conditioning, as you would abandon the idea that there's a second moon. So what we need to do is renounce the idea that there's an external world, which is quite tough. Tolle called his book The Power of Now, now with a capital N, because the past is simply memory and the future is simply conjecture. They're both the past and the future are clearly objects of the mind. They're fabrications of the mind. They're not what is going on in reality, and reality is what is happening right now. And in the same way, maybe he could have written a book called The Power of Here, with a capital H. And this is maybe a bit harder to come to terms with. We can easily see that the past and the future are mental fabrications, but surely there's something there and there's something here. Surely there's such a thing as distance, surely there's such a thing as space. Well, again, all these, if you look into this, if you really examine this, you'll find that there is no such thing as distance. It is another convention, another way of talking about things. So this is very much about the power of here, because everything that there is actually here. And then we ascribe to then what happens is, within that, certainly within the visual field of experiencing, the visual aspect of the field of experiencing, we identify objects, and with these objects we attribute distance to them. But they're actually here. They're being experienced here. They're not being experienced out there. This is perhaps easier to understand with sound rather than with visual objects. When you hear a sound, well, where are you hearing that sound? You might have noticed there's the sound of seagulls here, and so when I hear that sound of a seagull, I automatically, there's one now, I automatically attribute that sound to something over there. But where is that sound happening? It's happening right here. It's when, and then what I do is I analyse that, and I say it's the sound of a seagull and it's happening out there. But it's not happening out there, it's happening here. The sound is here, just as all the visual objects are here as well. It's all happening here, and we ascribe distance to it. We externalise it, but it's happening here. So that's the power of here. You are not the doer of any action here, O Rama. So why do you assume doership? When one alone exists, who does what and how? So now we're talking about, now Vasistha's started talking about doership and action. How does this follow on from the first paragraph? Well, if we assume there's no external world, what's the assumption what's the conclusion we're inclined to make? Oh, it's just little old me here, by myself. Well, no, there's no me here either, there's no doer. There's nobody that's actually getting on with things. This is the other part of the story. We assume there's an external world and there's me going around doing things in it. And if we get rid of the notion of an external world, we have to get rid of the notion that there's a little me wandering around doing things in that external world. And whenever we one of the problems of when we give up the idea that there's no doer, then the next thing is, well, why bother doing anything? And Vasistha addresses this. Do not become inactive either, for what is gained by doing nothing? What has to be done has to be done. Therefore, rest in the self. You do what needs to be done, rather than chasing after cravings and dealing with aversions. You just do what needs to be done, rather than behave in order to bolster up your egoistic sense. Even while doing all the actions natural to you, if you're unattached to those actions, you are truly the non-doer. If you are doing nothing and are attached to that non-doership, then you are doing nothing. You become the doer. So if you make a point of saying, well, since I'm going to stop doing things, well, that's still an action. You're making a point of bolstering your egoistic notions by not doing something. When all this world is like the juggler's trick, what is to be given up and what is to be sought? So in other words, the juggler's trick is referring to the story of Lavana, who was hypnotized by what's called here as a juggler or magician. You don't take your cue from the trick. You don't take your cue from the delusion.